Okay, it's round one to the clone. I was rather hoping that by this point, rather than seeing this video, you would have seen at least part 3 of Revenge of the Clone, if not part 4 of Revenge of the Clone. Basically my attempt to clone an SSD to run this Muse Receptor that's sitting behind me on screen. But alas, with all these things, not everything is as simple as you think it is. And at this point I should thank Andy for spending 2 hours on the phone with me the other night talking all things Receptor. I think he said he had 4 receptors, including a basic Rev C and a Quattro. So thank you, Andy. Even though we haven't solved the problem, I think we've managed to get ourselves moving in the right direction. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. So what is the status of the project? Well, the project is basically on hold at the moment. I've got to source some more bits and do a little bit more research. But what I have established so far, put my scripts down, get my bits out. This is the Samsung SSD that I purchased to do the job. The problem is that this Samsung SSD is not recognised by the MSI got to read this, 7142 motherboard that sits inside the Muse. So I've tried all kinds of permutations to try and get this thing working by changing settings in the BIOS, and a lot of people have said several things on the internet user groups. Some are true, some are not, and I'll leave it at that. But nothing I can do in the BIOS will allow the BIOS to see this as a drive attached to one of the SATA ports on the motherboard. So first thing I did is I thought that this was an iffy drive. And it does happen, it's very rare, but they do come along every now and then that you end up with a drive that doesn't work. So next thing is I go down to storage and I pick up this thing. This is my SATA reader. It's externally powered, hence the plug that's dangling on the end there, and it connects to your computer via USB. I've got wires dangling everywhere. Okay, so plug that into the back of the Muse, because the Muse will read an external boot device or external hard drive. So I plug that into one of the rear USB ports on the back of the Muse. Plug in the SSD. Go into the BIOS. Bingo! It can see this drive in that USB caddy. Then I plug this drive into my Windows machine, thinking that it might be something that's still iffy with the drive. I'm able to format it, I'm able to read it, I'm able to write to it. This drive is not the problem. So I've ruled that out. Well, I'll come back to this in a sec. Next I thought maybe I purchased a bad SATA interface. Again, you know, these things are just put together by companies. You can get bad ones. So this is the interface that I bought. Some more fingers and thumbs. Let me put that down there for a sec. As you can see, that's the SATA interface. That's the power that goes off to a standard IDE power brick, and that's the data transfer cable that plugs into the motherboard. So I tried that in. I thought that was the problem. And the problem with the other machine I have that kind of is a SATA drive machine, which is this machine. It's sitting behind me. You can't see it. Is that the power for the devices is SATA in a SATA cable, power cable from the power supply. So it's not the old style white plugs that was on many of the machines. On this machine, it is a SATA power supply from the actual power supply. So what I couldn't do is I couldn't test this on that machine. So what I thought I'd do then is I'd order another 2 cables, which I did. And these are the cables. So there you have a SATA power cable, and you have a standard SATA data cable. They came through, still no joy. Then following the conversation with Andy, I took the SATA drive out of this Dell machine, which is the one that's behind me you can't see, and I plugged that into the SATA port of the Muse with this cable, and Bob's your uncle, Muse was able to see the SATA drive that is in my Dell. So now I've got to the point where I know this is working. I have eliminated that. I know that the IDE, the SATA port on the Muse can see a drive because it can see my Dell drive, and if I'd let it run on, it would have booted into Windows, which is what is on that Dell drive. But what it can't see is it can't see this SSD drive. So the conclusion is therefore that there is something in the BIOS that is stopping it reading this SSD drive. And the only thing I can think of at the moment is that this SSD drive is built to SATA 3 standards, whereas this Muse is built to SATA 1 standards. Now, according to every website in the world, you know, the theory is that a SATA 3 drive will work on a SATA 1 interface, but just slower, i.e. works at the speed of a SATA 1 interface, which I think is 1.5 megabits per second, as opposed to, or is it 1.5 gigabits per second, I can't remember, as opposed to 6, which is the SATA 3 standard. So that's the only thing I can come up with, and that this, for whatever reason, this is not backwards compatible with that. So what am I going to do? Well, I've got a couple of ideas. One is doing some sort of conversion. The other thing I've thought about is trying to get hold of a SATA 1 SSD of appropriate size. It doesn't matter whether it's bigger, just of an appropriate size. But that might involve me buying something second hand, because manufacturers don't sell SATA 1 SSDs anymore. They all sell SATA 3 SSDs. Bottom line, I've not been able to clone the Receptor hard disk using the SSD in any shape or form. What I did try to do is I tried to actually put the SSD into this caddy, plug it into the USB port, boot from my version of CloneZilla, which by this point is now sitting on a thumb drive, and you can change the boot sequence on the Muse to actually boot in a certain sequence. So the boot menu could see the SSD, it could see the internal drive, and it could see the thumb drive. And I was able to tell it to boot from the thumb drive, which it did merrily. And then I was able to clone the hard disk in here, and I've done it several times, I have to be honest. And on each time, it has not written the boot sector to the SSD, so that the SSD could boot the Muse. So I don't know what's going on there, and again, I've had a lot of time talking to Andy, and he says he uses a different flavour of CloneZilla, a flavour that's been wrapped into Parted Magic, which is the option that's going to cost me $13. But I haven't bought Parted Magic yet, because I need to get a drive that works, because this one clearly doesn't. So a little bit more trial and error there, I think. So I haven't finished with this. It may take a few more weeks to get it finished while I wait for more parts to arrive. In fact, you know, to quote Dave Murray, I spent far too much time on this video already. But I think it's worth pursuing because the problems I'm experiencing cloning this Rev C are problems that everybody else who will try to clone a Rev C will experience. And as I say, if you go to the internet forums, they all say it can be done. What none of them tell you is how. And this is the big thing. You know, I don't know whether people are jumping on the bandwagon saying it can be done because somebody told them it can be done, or whether it can be done because they've done it. Now, speaking to Andy, Andy has done it, but there are some caveats in that Andy had his Rev C before Muse went bust. Andy had his Rev C upgraded to 64-bit OS before Muse went robust, and Andy has had an upgraded motherboard put in his Rev C before Muse went bust. So there are the variables between my situation and his situation are slightly different, and it's those variables that always you know, knock things out for you. But what I thought I'd do with the remainder of this video is tell you some stuff that I've learned along the way. So here goes. You need a certain type of keyboard to work when you're working in the BIOS and other Linux boot functions on the Muse Receptor. So when I acquired this Muse Receptor, the previous owner gave me a USB wired keyboard and mouse. And for normal Receptor operations, they work perfectly, okay? So don't get me wrong, it wasn't something he gave me that didn't work. They work perfectly. So USB keyboard and mouse work perfectly with the Muse Receptor in normal operation. However, if you want to do certain things in the BIOS, or you need to do certain things in the Linux at a command line level, a wireless keyboard and mouse don't work. And the reason for that is quite simple, that the interface that runs them hasn't been loaded. So what you need is a keyboard, and here is a keyboard, which is an old keyboard I had lying around in storage, which has an old PS2 style connector on it, which is the round 6-pin DIN connector, the sort of very diddy one. And quite often, when you buy a keyboard, or when you used to buy a keyboard, I don't know whether now, if you buy a USB keyboard, which is what this is, they give you the converter. And I've got several of these knocking around in various places. Not quite sure where they all are, but anyway, this keyboard has that connector in the or in the box that it was in, so that was relatively easy to find. But it kind of whammied me, and I'll tell you the reason why it kind of whammied me is because as I've been going through the learning process and changing settings, etc., I think I I thought I'd food barred the actual disk that was in the receptor. That caused me a bit of a problem because it meant I couldn't do anything at command line level to actually run the check disk, the Linux check disk program. Was it FSDK or DS or something like that? I can't remember. I'm not a Linux engineer. I have to look this stuff up every time I have to do this sort of stuff. I know roughly what it is, but anyway, when I was trying to run that command, I couldn't do it because I couldn't get into I couldn't run a command line because I didn't have the appropriate interface. So USB drivers aren't loaded at that point, so you have to actually have an interface that plugs into the PS2 socket on the back of the Muse Receptor to do it. So luckily, as I say, luckily I had one of those knocking around in storage. I was able to go down and get that the other morning before I started work, and I was able to fix the disk problem I had. And the stress level went down on Overwatch. The Muse Receptor can use a wireless keyboard and mouse. Yes, in the same way it supports a USB wired keyboard and mouse, the Muse Receptor also supports a wireless keyboard and mouse. And for the sake of this test that I did, because I have been using it, I've been using this Jellycomb keyboard here, standard wireless keyboard, about £25 I think they are. Comes with the mouse. There's the mouse, and the wireless bit is in the back of the receptor. And actually that makes the receptor far easier to use because you aren't constrained by the wire. So it means you can have the receptor way away, the monitor wherever you need it, and the mouse close to the monitor, because you don't need to do an awful lot with the keyboard per se, unless you're actually changing names. So most of the stuff you do on the receptor you can do with the mouse. But yeah, so you can use a wireless keyboard and mouse, which is a big plus. Now what I don't know is whether this particular one is a quirk of the receptor that I have, or it's a standard feature of the receptors, or it's a quirky feature of the receptors. And that is that this front socket is pretty much only big enough to get a USB cable in it. For argument's sake, that's my USB pen drive I've been using for Clonezilla, okay, and that will not fit through the opening here. It's too fat to get to this front USB socket. But say for example that style of USB cable will fit through there to plug into the board, but it's upside down. So normally you plug it in the same way as you plug it into the back, but on the front it is actually upside down. Now I don't know whether that's a common feature of receptor or whether it's just a quirk of mine. Now, as I said, I am not a Linux engineer. Okay, I know how to sort of kind of navigate my way around a Linux machine, but it's not something I would claim to be, and I'm not a hardcore Linux coder or embedded Unix coder. But if you are interested, this thing is built on Red Hat Linux. And I also suspect that it is employing the Linux RATA interface, which stands for Real-Time Application Interface, or Real-Time Application Extension, Interface Extension, which allows it to operate real time. So instead of having to make changes and write those changes to disk, the real-time extension effectively allows those changes to be made on the fly. It's a lot of what a lot of industrial control systems use. It's also the same mechanisms used on the Oasis and the Kronos. So the reason I make that statement is because a lot of Linux Unix commands are quite universal in terms of, if you know how to run Red Hat Linux, you know how to a lot of the basic commands of Ubuntu and SysLinux and a number of other flavors of Linux that have, and Unix, that have evolved over time. But be careful, because different flavors of Linux sometimes have different terminology or different query statements. Now, if any of you have ever written a Linux command in command line, you will know that if you get one space wrong or you mistype a character, it can do all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. And that's just the quirk of Linux. And to be honest, you know, if you were using a machine, a basic Windows machine in command line, you'd be doing the same. But in Linux, it punishes you more, should I say. So what I would say is, if you are going to go into the command line of this thing to do stuff like I've had to do to fix the disk drive, then make sure you're typing the Red Hat commands and not commands for the version or flavour of Linux you're used to. Just a word to the wise, but it does operate Red Hat Linux. Okay, I've moved the camera angle. Don't worry, you'll be able to see what's going on this screen because I'm making a screen grab of it. But when I got my receptor, I kind of accepted that the boot speed was basically the boot speed. And it took a while for it to boot up, and that was fine, and I didn't really have a problem with that. But as I've been going through this process of trying to get the SSD to work on this particular machine, I've come across a series of, if you like, what's the word I'm looking for? Tweaks to the BIOS that actually significantly improve the boot time. So I'm going to show you what they are and talk you through what they are. So these will appear on the screen in front of me, probably around here, as I go through this, or I'll put myself up into the corner of the screen. I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. So if I switch this on, and as it's booting up, you press down the delete key, and that will basically, with a bit of luck, get you into the BIOS. So you're looking at the BIOS, and there's a number of things in here that we might want to change. The first thing to change is use the arrow keys, and you can go up and down with the arrow keys, and you press the enter key, and you go into this first menu, which is the standard CMOS features. And what's really interesting about this is if you look at the top of the screen, it says CNOS, not CMOS. But I just thought I'd point that out. And if you go into here, and if you use the arrow keys to go down to the floppy drive, which is down at this point of the screen here, if this does not say none, change it to none. So you press the enter key, and you move the arrow key to move that little sort of block up and down with the various options, and you select none, and effectively what it does is it puts this floppy drive to none. Why do you want to do that? Well, the Muse, when it's going through the boot cycle, is going to spend time trying to find the floppy drive. There is no floppy drive on this machine. So in order to stop it trying to spend that time trying to find the floppy drive, you just turn the floppy drive off. So that's the first one, first change you might want to make. If you press escape, you go back to the main menu, and the next thing we want to do is go into advanced BIOS features, and we click enter again, and then what we do is we go into the boot sequence, and if you haven't got hard drive as the first boot device, then again click enter on hard drive and use the arrow keys to select hard drive, and then go to second boot device and say you want to disable that, and then go to third boot device and say you want to disable that. Because you've only got one hard drive that you're booting from, so it's pointless the machine trying to look for multiple devices. And when I first came into this menu here on my machine, it said floppy drive, CD-ROM, hard drive. The CD-ROM and the floppy drive don't exist, but the machine would spend time looking for those devices, so that trying to boot from them before it tried to boot from the hard drive. So that is effectively what you need to change there. If you then click escape to come out of this menu, and you go down to this full screen logo to show. Now if you're getting a big logo, sort of white two-tone logo that comes to the screen that says tab to see a list of what does it say, tab to post and del to go into the BIOS, again that takes time, because what the machine does is it pauses while it's waiting for you to put an input, and if you don't put an input within a given parameter, then it carries on to boot. Well, if you don't want to do any of that, why have the screen? So again, full screen logo to show. If that is reading enabled, put it to disabled, click enter, and press escape to get out of this one. So there's a couple of you might want to change. It improves the setup and the speed of boot. The next thing you might consider changing is not that one. Oh, where am I going? Integrating peripherals. That's where I want to go. And funny enough, this is actually where you set the SATA up, because if you go down to IDE and press enter, you see at the top of the screen here it says on chip SATA. It's kind of where I'm going at the moment, and that has to be enabled for SATA to work on this machine, which is why I've been really confused about the fact it doesn't work with the new SSE I bought. But I'm not going to change that. If you go up to the top here and you see it says AC97 controller, you are using a custom board that Muse have built for this machine to generate the sounds, etc. You're not using any of the onboard chipsets. So what you might want to do here is disable those onboard chipsets to give you a bit more resources on the machine. Again, you press enter, you use the arrow keys to move that block up and down, and then you click enter to save. And there are just a couple of things you can do in the BIOS just to make Receptor boot quicker, and it does boot significantly quicker. When I come out, you'll see that. Then what we do is we go escape, we move across with the arrow keys to save and exit setup, we click enter, we enter Y because we do want to save the BIOS settings, we click enter, it will now save those BIOS settings, and it will then try to boot the machine. And as you can see, it's starting to go through the boot menu. And as I say, my experience of having done this is that it boots significantly quicker than it did when it was with those options set on effectively. So by disabling them, you're making it boot a lot quicker. And of course, now I'm videoing it, it won't boot as quick. It's kind of sod's law, isn't it? There you go. Just watching down here. Yeah, it's boot. It's there. Bang. So that's the boot sequence, and you're into the Muse screen. And if I wiggle my mouse, this is my wireless mouse. You can see my wireless mouse is working on this beautifully. Now, one of the things I've learned from the last couple of days is don't just switch it off, okay? The last part is, if you are going to switch it off, hit that shutdown key, and it will shut the machine down properly and close all open files and stuff like that. So there you go. The clone has Revenge of the Clone. The clone has won round 1. See you next time. Live long and prosper. Bye bye.